Hi, and welcome to another episode of Everything Digital Health. Today I'm going to do a quick return to the issue of NHS open source policies, which, as you'll recall, I did a video a couple of weeks back about how all the open source policies had been removed. And since then, Digital Health News got involved. They put the question to NHS England themselves as to why these policies had been removed, and they got an answer. So I'm going to go through that and discuss a little bit of the fallout from that. So first of all, what am I actually talking about? So this is the Digital Health News story. NHS England removed all its open source policy web pages, and I did a previous episode which I'll link to, which has got all the links that you can go and check. And I've tested all those links today, and they are all still gone. There's nothing that's come back. It wasn't sort of that they made an error and then sort of fixed it. And so the issue I have with this, firstly, NHS England have not really been doing open source for many years anyway. So it's not news. I don't think it changes that much about how open source is managed. And the presence or absence of a policy on it sort of doesn't matter if you've got nobody in the organisation who's actually prepared to drive open source and do the work that's needed. But at least having open source policies did give you something to point to. So the response from NHS England was that they deliberately removed these policies. It wasn't an accident. They've been doing a kind of refresh of the web presence, and as part of that, they've removed some old stuff. And that the NHS England are now essentially deferring to an overarching policy on gov.uk, as in all government services, including the NHS, are expected to follow this service standard. This is the service standard, or this is one of them. Be open and use open source. Publish your code, use open source to improve transparency, flexibility and accountability. I'm not sure that I've seen a massive amount of this. This has been in place since 2017. And whereas the GDS are often seen as like beacons of having done great stuff in government digital with open source and promoting an openness agenda in terms of open data, open governance, open source, open standards. The NHS has done none of that, and still, even now, is spending large amounts of money to essentially buy custom software that it doesn't own. So it's a really peculiar thing to want to do. I mean, what we usually think of about procurement of software is procuring something that's off the shelf. So if you're buying a piece of software that already exists, then essentially it's commoditized and it's going to be cheap. An example of that in theory is something like Microsoft Windows. You know, they don't build it for the NHS. We just buy licenses to use Microsoft Windows. We get the off-the-shelf thing. However, NHS England does an awful lot of commissioning of bespoke software. And when it's commissioning bespoke software, it absolutely could say, you have to make it open source. You know, we're paying the money. It's bespoke for the NHS. We, as the customer, say, make it open source. And then you just invite tenders from organisations that want to produce that open source software. If there are companies who don't wish to produce open source software because perhaps it interferes with their ability to lock in the customers or to enshitify the service later, then you just don't invite them. You know, they'll self-exclude if you say, we're only interested in buying an open source build. This is the actual government.uk service standard, point 12, make new source code open. So it's very clear, if you're creating new source code, you have to make it open. If that is not possible, provide a convincing explanation of why this cannot be done for specific subsets of the source code. So bearing in mind this is government-wide, there might be areas of the source code where there is a very sensitive new government policy. I think that's mentioned down here. There's a few cases where you should not publish code in the open. For example, code that relates to a sensitive government policy that has not yet been announced. This is very clear, and I think if NHS England were following this, firstly, there'd be a lot more open source and a lot more support for open source platforms and software across the NHS. And secondly, we'd be spending less on software. Why we're not following this, I don't know. So it's totally disingenuous for NHS England to claim that they've removed their open source policies because they're now following this government-wide one, because nobody's following this in any part of the NHS that I've seen. I think it's also important to note that this change in the way the open source policies are documented was not communicated with anybody. So I think if this was a deliberate change, then there would have been some kind of communication. Having an open source community means treating them with respect. And I think if you are trying to foster a community of open source, firstly, there should be some place where you bring them all together. So there should be an NHS open source forum platform, for example, where we can all go and discuss open source. And that's where the announcement should go that says, oh, by the way, we're moving all the policies, we're deprecating these policies because we're actually going to defer to the gov.uk ones. That didn't happen. There was, in fact, no announcement whatsoever about this change in open source policy. We don't really know if it's a change. It's just deletion of things. That's something that I think is bad. I think we should have better transparency around these kind of things. They should, as an organisation that has a community of open source, and certainly they spent a lot of time between 2015 and say 2020 developing that open source community, there is a responsibility to communicate with them respectfully and appropriately, and I think that's being missed here. And these are all the sites that were taken down. This is the open source digital playbook that was taken down, replaced by the blueprinting site that I clicked through briefly. This is the 404 that was digital technology open source, and this is the Wayback Machine version of it, which explains the benefits of open source, etc. And I'm sad to see this go, but I'm also aware that nobody was doing this. So having a policy is very different from doing something about it. And I think we've spent enough money now. Surely it is time to try something different. Because if you've done something repeatedly and it's failed again and again, which demonstrably buying expensive proprietary platforms and then paying for them to be customized for the NHS at incredible expense, that's failed because we do not have the joined up patient-centric records that we want. We don't have clinician-friendly software across the NHS. So it has failed. And in that circumstance, when something's failed, doing the same thing again and again and again and hoping that one day it will succeed is obviously stupid. So we need to change the entire way we think about this. And that's got to come from the centre, from the top. There has to be a reinvigoration of the idea of open source, plus the resources to do something about it. And I don't want them to replace the policy. I want a team that does open source. And that's when we'll start to see the benefits. It's a particularly good time for this to happen as well, to build that sort of in-sourced, in-house team that does NHS digital stuff in open source, because the timescales and the cost of building software have just dropped through the floor because of agentic coding. And it's really now getting quite exciting how quickly you can build stuff. You can do it securely and openly at the same time. With a relatively small team, you can build quite impressive stuff. And that's what we should be doing. I'd lead that team. I would be very happy to be the person who pushes this all through. But it doesn't have to be me. There are much better people than me who could do this. But someone's got to do it. The point is that going around in circles, wringing our hands and not knowing what to do, and spending more and more money with bigger and bigger megacorps is actively making things worse. So we have to know when to stop, and then we have to know what to do next. Interestingly, the NHSX open source policy is still there. I think I put that in the last video. And I found that the NHS still has its own digital service manual, NHS service standard. You'll recognise this is almost identical to the gov.uk, which makes sense. It's essentially derived from the same thing. And it's great to see that we do have a service manual, and it's just sad to see it's practically completely ignored. We've got a lot of points here that aren't particularly well adhered to. Understand users and their needs in the context of health and care. Working towards solving a whole problem for users. Joined up experience, simple to use. Now, some aspects of this perhaps are being done well, possibly bits within the NHS app, for example, but I'm not sure that you can create a team of any kind of capability in an organisation that's undergoing a merger with another organisation and in a context of tens of thousands of people being made redundant from ICBs. The background of chaos does not exactly foster a spirit of team working. Agile ways of working never caught on in the NHS, iterate, etc. These are all very good things that we should be doing, and sadly I'm not sure that we are. There have been pockets of this happening in the NHS, both in time and place. So in the past, the NHS had done better stuff towards open standards, for example, the NHS design system and things like NHS front end. But we aren't doing those things now. And also other parts of it's not equally distributed across the NHS. So there might be a bit of it happening in the NHS app or somewhere else, but then and there'll be trusts doing their bit to do agile, but then there's just still so much that's unreformed about this that we don't get anywhere. Anyway, so that's my kind of rebuttal of what the NHS England line is, that that they're using the gov.uk service standard. The answer is no, you're not. I also think if you did decide to remove a bunch of web pages in order to defer to an overarching governmental standard, you would say that. You'd put a web page that said, we've moved the open source standard because we don't need one anymore. The link is here, gov.uk, and you go there and you can see that's the standard you should be adhering to. They didn't do that. So I'm still thinking cock-up rather than conspiracy. I'm still thinking they just don't know what they're doing with open source, and I suspect it's just been moved, deleted on the basis that no one quite had a plan for it. Anyway, the fact still remains, open source is the only way for medicine. That means that the NHS would benefit from open source significantly, and I just think there needs to be a change of direction. It's a good time to do it because half of the senior digital leadership of the NHS has left. So whoever they get in to replace those people needs to start listening to the mood music. And essentially, you go and have a look at what the rest of the tech industry is doing. It's very common, even among big megacorps in the normal tech industry, for them to be contributing actively to open source. Google, Facebook, Netflix, they are all very big players in the open source world. And they produce pieces of open source infrastructure, they share them, they understand that is of wider benefit to them. So even though you might say, well, why would they give away some piece of software? They're establishing that piece of software as a standard that other people can use, which makes it easier for them to recruit in the future, for example. So Facebook produced a piece of software called React, which is widely used to make web pages look nicer and be a bit more sort of snappy and interactive. The fact that they open source that, and that it is now essentially the dominant JavaScript framework for making web pages reactive, it means that they can hire from a massive pool of people who already know React. So that's just one way that this can benefit you by being a big player in the open source movement. And I think the NHS is absolutely the right place to do it. We already understand sharing. We understand the sharing of risk, of healthcare risk, because that's what the NHS is for. We understand the sharing of healthcare knowledge. So we have cancer networks and we share academic papers and we share guidance and learning between organisations within the NHS. So why wouldn't we share our software? It actually makes complete sense that that's what we would be doing, and that's what we should be doing. Anyway, that's enough as a quick update, and I'll see you in the next one.